Recently, we have looked quite a bit at the life of David, looking back in the accounts of his life, and there are just a lot of lessons that we can learn from David, and even some probably that I haven't covered yet. But before we move on from David, I've actually got one more lesson I want to share and learn from with you about David and his life, and it's really what is ultimately said about his life later in the book of Acts when Paul was in the synagogue in Antioch and he was given the opportunity to speak, and he's ultimately, Paul goes to talk about how Jesus is the one that has been raised from the dead. But I want to look at what Paul said about David, and Paul giving the history about David becoming king, and David, eventually dying. But look with me in Acts chapter 13. Acts chapter 13 and in verse 22. We've talked about this already, maybe even used or mentioned this verse in a previous video when talking about why God first called David. But notice what it says in Acts chapter 13, verse 22. That when God had removed Saul, he raised up for them David as king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. That was the testimony of God about David. And that's what I want my testimony to be about my life. That's what I want God to be able to say about me. I want God, and I think we all should want this, for God to look at us and say, I have found Kevin. I have found whatever your name is. I have found him or her to be a man or woman after my own heart who will do all my will. And when I'm dead and gone and not here anymore, not that it's about, people don't need to, remember me and, whatever. But what I want to be said about me when I'm not here anymore is that I was a man who did the will of God. A man who loved God and who did the best I could, gave my heart's all to serve God, to live my life for Him. This is what we should want God to say about us. But then, if you look later in verse 36, finally what Paul says of David, he says in verse 36, For David, after he had served his own generation, or served in his own generation by the will of God, fell asleep, was buried with his fathers. But a lot of other, that's the New King James translation of that verse. That David, after he had served his own generation by the will of God, fell asleep, he died. But a whole lot of others, almost every other translation that I looked at, words this a bit differently and really, ultimately, I think, shares the message of what is being said here. That a lot of other translations word this, that David, after he had served the purpose of God, that David served the will of God in his own generation. Again, that is what I want to be known and said about me. What we all as God's people should want is that we all live in a certain time period. We only live for so long. We're only here on earth, can only have an impact and influence for a certain number of years. And I think all of us as Christians, as children of God, as servants of God, should want it to be said that I served the will of God. I served the purpose of God in my lifetime. That's what I lived for. That while I was living and breathing and had time and opportunity, I did my best to serve the purpose that God has for me, that God has for all of us. The purpose He reveals to us in His Word, the purpose to live for Him and glorify Him and love Him and keep His commandments and live for the day when we can one day be with Him in heaven. When I look at this and I read this, I hear this about David, what is said of him long after he's gone. That David was a man after God's own heart. He had that testimony from God that David wanted to do the will of God. Doesn't mean he was always perfect at it. We've already seen some lessons where David, he served his own heart sometimes, his own will. But ultimately, David was a man who wanted to do the will of God. And he was a man who served God's purpose in his own lifetime. That's what I want to do. And I hope that's what you want to do. I hope that's what we're striving to do, trying to do every day and grow in and do better in. Knowing that we're not guaranteed tomorrow. We're not sure how long we'll even have. But once we die, then we run out of time. We run out of time to have an impact and influence, to serve God by serving others, and to be a light in this world, and to teach others, and to help others, and to love others, all to the glory of God. So today, tomorrow, let's make sure we're making the best use of our time. Make sure we are serving the purpose of God in our life, and that we are people after God's own heart, seeking to do His will. God bless.